Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to create an effect something like this. So you can see we've got this tangled mass of fibres and there's a lot of colour in the scene, and actually most of that is coming from the lighting rather than the materials on this tangle of fibres. And I've made a couple of different ways to move the camera through the scene, and I'll demonstrate how to do that. So if we move on a little bit, we can see some of the different ways. So it's actually following some of this tangled mass, and here it's actually looking back at the mass of tangled fibres, just to give you a bit of an idea of what it looks like. And I actually molded this tangled mess around the idea of the shape of a tree. So although you don't get to really see that, that's what this is sort of vaguely shaped around. And I'll show you how to do that. So to begin with, we're going to use the ivy generator, but that needs something to grow up. And in order to do that, we need to put some kind of mesh into the scene. Now you could just put a box or a cylinder or whatever, depending on what you're trying to create. But I decided to use the tree generator. So I'm going to add a curve, because trees are curves. And there you can see it's sapling tree gen. Now make sure, if you can't see that option in there, go to Preferences, Add-ons, and just start typing sapling in here. And make sure the Add Curve Sapling Tree Gen is on. And you can see I've got a default tree come up, and we can open these options down here and choose different things. It doesn't matter too much. You're probably not going to cover the entire tree in Ivy, but you can choose from some of the presets down here or make some changes yourself. But really you don't need an awful lot of tree to do this, but having some is helpful. So I'm going to go with this interesting sort of tree here. Having created the tree, we can't add an ivy to a curve. We need to be able to add it to a mesh. So press F3 and just start typing convert, and you can see we get object convert to, and we just select that and we'll say convert to mesh from curve. So you shouldn't see any difference, except when you go into edit mode, you can see this is now a mesh. So with that object selected, we need to open up the window on the right hand side. There's a little arrow there you can click, or we can just press N and up it comes. And if we go to create, and the top option is Ivy Generator. Again, under Edit and Preferences, start typing Ivy and make sure the Add Curve Ivy Gen is on as well. So I'm going to give you some initial starting settings to enter, but you will find you'll probably need to try a few different options. First thing I did was turn off Grow Leaves. We're not actually trying to make ivy, so we don't need that. Maximum time can stay at 0. That just means it will grow for as long as it wants to. Max ivy length. So we probably want to increase this. I can see here my tree is getting on for 5 Blender units tall. You may just be able to make out the grid there. So I'm just going to go for, say, 4 on that. Ivy size. This is the individual segments of the ivy. So that's quite small. So it will take a long time with the ivy going in all sorts of different directions to grow any significant distance. So you may want to increase that. Let's try 0.1 for that, which is quite a lot bigger. Float length is about how much the ivy can move away from the object up which it is crawling. So let's just go with the default for that. And max adhesion length is how long it will run along the object before it decides it's going to grow out into open air, as it were. So weight and random weight, these are to do with how much gravity affects the growth of the ivy. We'll go with the defaults for now. And then we've got things like the adhesion weight and so on. These are the main ones that you want to play with, but let's see what happens if we now select Add New Ivy. And you can see we've got an ivy that's shot up the tree there, and that may be suitable. If it's not, with the old one you were able to sort of update it. With the current options, you have to just delete that ivy, reselect your mesh. You still got the same settings in here, so I'm going to go now for 5 meters on that. Maybe we'll go with a slightly smaller unit size for the ivy, and perhaps we'll go with a float size that's 0.75. And let's add new ivy now. So that took a little longer, and now we've got a slightly thicker ivy. Once you've got an ivy you're happy with, Obviously I can just hide my tree just to see what it looks like. Once you're happy with it, that's fine, and we can then remove the tree. So there's my tree, and I'm just going to delete it. I also, as it happens, turned my tree upside down. That's just an aesthetic choice. So this ivy is basically a curve, which means that we can play around with its settings over here in curve settings. Before we do that though, let's put some light in the scene. So I'm just going to add a light which is a point light. We'll put that over here. I went for quite a high power. We'll put this at about 125 watts. And one of the things I should have said is that I did mine all in EV. So we'll go into EV mode now. And the reason I mention that now is because it will change some of the options for the lamp. I decreased the radius to 0.125, so that just makes the shadows a little sharper. And then we can play around with color and so on. So I'll just make this one slightly yellow. So we'll just go with that one lamp for now. I'm going to pull down a little window up here and we'll make that a shader window. Select our object here, go to materials, and we'll just give it a material. And we'll do some things with that in a moment. So I'm now going to turn off the selection overlay, so get rid of all that orange. And I'm going to go to rendered view. I'm also going to go to the background. I'm going to set that to black for the time being. So obviously we haven't got any complicated materials on this or anything. So there is our tangle. Obviously the blender units in the one that I did, the little subunits were quite a bit smaller, so I had more detail on the curve. But this is still a curve. So if we can go to the curve properties, we can play around with some things in here. So if we open geometry and come down to bevel, I actually reduced the resolution of mine because I had an awful lot of vertices in my scene, so I wanted to cut them down a bit. For this scene I haven't created such a dense tangle, so I wouldn't necessarily need to. You can see I've only got 143,000 down here, and even after reducing the vertices I had 12 million vertices in my other scene, and that's quite a lot. So I'm going to leave that where it is for the moment, but what we can do is play around with the bevel depth, and you can see if I increase that, all my lines get thicker, or if I go the other way they get thinner. So for this scene let's thicken that up a little bit. So now let's do something with the material. So I gave it a sort of slightly yellowish colour, that's a bit more yellow in it than that. And importantly I gave it a little bit of subsurface, not very much but just a tiny bit. So I went with 0.01. You can see how the whole thing changes all of a sudden. So at 0 it's very flat and sort of almost cartoony shading. Then I go to 0.01 of subsurface and suddenly there are additional colours in the scene. You can see there's sort of redness here. And that's because subsurface is simulating a sort of surface translucence, a bit like skin, where light passes into the object. Some colours of light are absorbed, and some colours bounce around and then escape from the object. And that pretty much on particularly the darker sides, light is coloured as it escapes from the darker side, and generally the light from the brighter side is slightly brighter because more light is coming back. I gave it a fairly shiny finish, so under roughness I went with 0.05, and that starts to give it a bit sort of little shiny highlights in places. I also added a transmission of 0.205. I'm not sure if that made a huge difference, but you can see there is a slight difference in the scene. If I set that back to 0, it brightens up slightly. So I guess some of the light is passing through. The thinking being that when I have the camera inside it, there's still a little bit of light coming through. And that's really all I did for the material on that. And I might even go slightly lower on that transmission, I think. Next, we need to go to the render settings. We've got more to do with the lights yet, but if we go to the render settings, this little sort of computer TV symbol here, I turned on ambient occlusion. I'm not sure it made a huge difference, but I turned it on. I also turned on bloom, and you'll see that will make a difference. We get this sort of glow around things. And I kept it at pretty much the default settings for that. For depth of field, I actually did end up using a depth of field in order to get a slight defocus on elements of the scene that were very near or far from the camera. And I turned that down to a max size of 50. So this is just the bokeh. When you defocus something, you get a sort of pattern, a blurry pattern around it, and this is just the max size of that bokeh. I left it on default for subsurface scattering, but I turned on screen space reflections, and you can see quite a bit changed in the scene there. So that's now where, if I turn that off and you look here, this dark area here, which we know is shiny, It's not reflecting any of this bright stuff over here, but when I turn that on, suddenly you can see we are getting reflections, which just adds to some of the complexity of the scene. Other than that, I left that on default. For my scene, I didn't use motion blur. I didn't use volumetrics. I did play around with doing some volumetrics, but eventually I didn't use that, and I stuck with the default for the shadows. So having done all that, we can now set up a few lights. So it already looks quite interesting, but obviously needs a little more work yet. All I did was duplicate a couple of lights around like this, some closer and some further, and change their colours. So I had a few that were quite a light white colour, others that were a stronger yellow colour, and some that quite a strong red colour. And then just select them all, Shift D, and for example rotate Z 45 and then rotate X 180. So if we now look at our scene, I'll just select my camera, which is down here, just turn it on, drag this down. We're going to do a little bit more with the camera in a minute, and we'll see what that's looking like. So that bloom's a little high possibly for the brightness of lights that we've got. Although it's interesting, it's possibly a bit over the top. I'll turn off the overlay and that makes it a bit clearer. It's quite interesting. I actually quite like it in some ways, so you might like this to represent something or other, the crystalline object from Star Trek perhaps. But if that bloom is a bit over the top, obviously we can come in here and we can turn the threshold up, which will reduce it, and play around with some of the other things like radius, so that we can actually see what our object looks like. And I think probably I need some more coloured lights. So I turn overlays back on and come back out to here. I think I had some green ones as well. So let's have a nice strong green colour there. And perhaps put one in here as well. So we'll turn off our overlay and have a look at that. That's starting to look quite interesting. Perhaps we want some more red lights. You notice certain things like lamps, they actually disappear when you turn the overlays off. Worth bearing in mind. Make that a nice red one as well. So now we're getting a good variation in colour. And again, we can perhaps reduce the threshold a little bit because it's still a bit over the top. And you'll get a different effect every time because it will depend on all the different elements in the scene interacting. And that's the point of something like this. You're creating something that's relatively complex in terms of its shape, but quite easily, and therefore you will get a lot of variation. But I think that's quite interesting. You could obviously get it to follow the shape of a different type of tree as well. And now a little bit about moving the camera around it. Obviously you can do the usual thing of just keyframing the movement of the camera. I'll make the camera a little smaller so that we can move it closer to the object without it getting buried in the object. So we could just put it, say, here, keyframe that, press I to keyframe it, then put it here, and it will then move from one to the other. That's fine. We can add a curve, which I typically use a path. I use paths rather than just ordinary curves very often because when you go into edit mode, you get a nice set of arrows on them which shows you which way the camera is going to go. So if I now rotate that one something like this, grab that end, and perhaps I put it there, and just moving some of these points through, perhaps start it there. I'm going to apply all transforms to that curve, and then I'm going to select my camera, go to constraints, add an object constraint, and say follow path. I'm going to select the NURBS path, which is the path I just created. Now typically the camera will go flying off like that, so you just need to move it to roughly where you want it to begin, which is normally at the end of the curve. Now by default it may not follow the path because the path won't be animated, so you also need to click this button here. And now you can see it is following the path. However, it's not necessarily looking in the direction we want it to look. As you can see, for most of it we can't even see anything. There's another issue as well which I'll talk about. So what we want to do is get the camera to look down the path. So if I say follow curve, now you can see the camera is looking down the path, and you can see we're moving through, at least for some of it, our ivy object. And obviously we can play around tweaking this path just to make sure that enough of it, for our purposes, takes the camera inside if that's what we want, our Ivy. And if we play that, we can see what's going on. So one of the things you may notice, I've got the usual default 250 frames across here, but by the time we get to frame 100, everything's stopped. In fact, the camera's movement has stopped by that point. So if we look here, go back to the beginning and press play, you can see the camera moves down very quickly and we get to frame 100 and it's finished. It's likely that that's not exactly what we want. So with the curve selected, you don't need to be in edit mode. Go to curve properties, scroll down and look for path animation. And you should see it's ticked because we animated it through the button on the camera constraint. And you can see in here, it's set the path to exist for 100 frames. So it will only take 100 frames to traverse the path. So I might want the camera to go that whole path, but I might want it to take the whole 250 frames. So that's what I could put in here. Having done that, I can press play and you now see the camera is moving at about half that speed. If we look through, there it is. We might be less concerned about the camera taking the whole 250 frames to traverse that path, but we might want it to move a lot more slowly. So regardless of how many total frames we've got, we could set this to say 1000 frames. So that means it would take 1000 frames to go from one end to the other. If we press play now, you can see how slow the camera is moving. However, we might not want it to take the whole 250 frames just to reach our tangle. In which case we can play with another option. So if we select our camera and we go to our constraints, we can add an offset. So if you start to decrease that offset, put a negative number on it, you can see our camera is actually running down that path. So if I put -300 on here, you can see the camera is already most of the way into our tangle. So I press play now. So we've now got the camera going quite slowly, and yet we are starting where we want to start. And you can see it's quite an interesting effect. When we get to somewhere like here, you can see how these little tubes are disappearing in front of the camera. I actually stuck with that, and the reason for it is the clipping plane of the camera. So if we go to the camera options, you can see clip start and end. So clip start is the closest an object can approach the camera before which it stops being visible to the camera. If I increase this, you'll actually see more of the mesh disappear, or I decrease it to the minimum value, and we can pretty much see everything. You do get a few strange effects if you set it quite so low. We go with perhaps 0.001, and now it's looking okay, and you pretty much don't see anything disappear. But I stuck with 0.1, and that meant I still had some elements of these little tubes disappearing, which I thought was just an interesting effect. Of course, also important is end clipping. If you interpret meters as Blender units in this case, then this scene's only a few meters deep, and therefore 100 meters is not going to be an issue. But of course, if you had a very big model or you reduce this, it will actually disappear into the distance. So if we now go to the beginning, there's nothing there. As we go down, you can see the mesh starts to appear until it gets too close to the camera, when it disappears again. So this might be an interesting approach to give you some strange effects. But by default it's 100 meters, and that means you'll see the whole mesh if it's this sort of size. I also used depth of field, but I ended up using it quite subtly. So you can see there it's all gone very, very blurry, and that's partly to do with the level of the depth of field. So one of the things we can do, if I go back to the beginning of the animation and we go down to viewport display and we turn on limits, you can now see this is our clipping limits, and there's also a mark for the focal point. So if I play with the focus distance, which is currently 0, you'll see that marker moves. So if I wanted the focus to say be about there, I can do that. And now you can see that little area there is in focus, but everything else is out of focus. That's interesting of itself. If you have such a tight focus like that, it really gives you the impression that you're in the microscopic world looking through a microscope. So if I press play there, you get some really good previews now with Blender 2.8. So what if you want to expand the level that is in focus? Because that can mean an awful lot of your scene is actually out of focus. And if at some point the whole thing's out of focus, the viewer starts to sort of lose interest. What am I supposed to be looking at, sort of thing? So I started to increase the f-stop. And I actually ended up at about 400, which maybe is too much. and there's actually very little that is out of focus at this point. So you can play with that and sort of go for some level that just gives you that little bit of softening of the focus, perhaps when it gets really close to the camera. So if I come in here, maybe 30 is a bit too low, but so we're getting some things out of focus, a little softening of focus for things that aren't quite where that focal point is, but otherwise it's not too bad. I actually played around with adding something else to this as well, but before I get into that, I'm going to show you another way that we might want to follow a path for something like this. So if I select my tangle, I go to edit mode. Now I'm going to pick one of the curves, and here's a convenient one. And then I'm going to press Ctrl L. So I selected one of the segments, and I'm going to press Ctrl L. Now you may just be able to make out that that curve, that little ivy stem, tracks all the way through, and this particular one ends up, if I go to wireframe, we might be able to see it. It certainly comes down to somewhere about here. That's where it goes to. If I don't want that one, I could select this one here. Where does that one go? So that one goes up there. But what you really want is one that's going to travel a decent amount of the distance through the curve so that you've got plenty to play with, as it were. So once you've selected it all, press P and say separate. We've separated that curve out now. And as it happens, because it was close to the camera, it doesn't matter for this example, but I actually then turned up the resolution of my bevel. Remembering on my main one, I actually turned this down to about 1, so it was a very angular sort of pipe. But with this one, at 4, it's pretty good. I bet you can turn it higher. What I also did was I actually added a subdivision surface, so Ctrl 2, and you may have noticed that's actually smoothed it out. Now in this case, I could actually do that to the whole thing because there's not so many vertices. So I've now got just over 2 million vertices, but that's a lot less than I had in my main animation. So we've got a nice curve here all on its own. So let's just go back into here, see what it's looking like with that smoother little tangle. Looks good, that looks fine. And what we can do, because that is a curve, rather than following this path that I created, and I did several different animations, we could follow that curve. So that's the one there. So I'm going to give that one a different name. So that's the one I've got selected. So we'll call this Tangle Curve 1, just so that we can identify it. I'll go back to my camera and I'll go to the constraints, and we'll change this to Tangle Curve 1. Now, as always, the camera will go flying off a bit, and we haven't animated the path yet, so we'll click Animate. So I'm just going to hide the main tangle, and we'll also hide that other curve, just so we can see what we're doing. So in terms of location, the camera is not far off where it needs to be, but if I click -Y, that should point it in the right direction. But it's clearly not traveling along the curve yet, and the reason for that is because of this offset that we've got here. Because if you remember, by default we'll only have 100 frames on that curve. So I'll set that back to 0, and we can now see our camera is wobbling along that curve nicely. It's possibly not going in the direction we wanted. It's easy enough to turn that round if we wanted to. However, there are a couple of issues. So if we just go to Y, so there it is, but the curve obviously wriggles around a lot. So if we were to look through here and bring everything back that we disappeared, it's a nightmare. So obviously the first thing we want to do is add some resolution to that curve. So let's just hide that again. So we'll go over to the curve properties and we'll tell it to animate that over 1000 frames. So let's see what that does. Obviously it slows the camera down. It's still doing exactly the same motion, so it's still wobbling around all over the place, but it's doing it much more slowly. And we may, if we look through the camera, there you can see what it looks like. It's still pretty violent motion. And we may want to go to our camera and now put an offset on it just to get it through perhaps the beginning. And you can see how it's moving around. So that's interesting, and that might be what we want. But what I ended up doing, just to give me a little bit more control over it, was I added an empty. So empty is just a shape that never renders. It's just something we can use to control other things. So there's my empty. I'm going to put it up here somewhere for a minute. I'm going to add a constraint to that, which again is follow path. And I'm going to follow the tangle curve path. So you can see it moving around there. It's obviously not started in a sensible place, so I just need to put that back to the beginning of my tangle curve. And you can now see it tracks along it, so that's fine. But what I wanted was the camera to be sort of following this, but with a sort of damped path. So first of all, I needed to put an offset that put it somewhere in front of the camera. So there is the empty, there's the camera, and the empty is traveling ahead of the camera. So if I press play now, you can see they're both following the same path, but the empty is ahead. Next, I go to my camera and I add a track to constraint. I select the empty, and then you'll need to select different options in here to make it actually look at the empty. -Z was what worked for me, and it may need a slight tweak. To get this to work, I also needed to change the up axis to X. Now you can see that's no longer red. And if I turn off some of the viewport displays for the camera there, now we can see the camera is following that empty. So it just helps the camera, rather than to be slavishly following the curve in terms of the direction in which it is pointing, it's actually following something that's ahead of itself in the curve. It just gives a slightly more stable view. So I bring the rest of the curve back, and there it is. And we can now see we're getting a more interesting view there. And obviously you can pick different curves as you go along. So we just have a look at what that looks like in rendered terms, and turn off the overlay, which confuses things quite a bit. And then we can zoom through. This is the great thing about Eevee, of course, is it gives you a pretty good render fairly quickly. So we go with that, and then I'll just render that as a single frame, and then we'll just go to the compositor where I made a few other little tweaks. Under the compositor, we'll just click Use Nodes, and the first thing I did was to add, under color, a hue saturation value node. And I just put the saturation up to about 1.05. Don't want to go too mad with that. For this scene, that might even be too high. So maybe 1.025. Just to increase that intensity of some of the colors. And then finally, I'm going to add under matte an ellipse mask. And to start with, just replace the image with it and set the width to 1. And I had the height set to about 0.55. I'm going to add a filter, which is a blur filter. Set it to fast Gaussian. Relative, which allows it to account for, when you select that, the difference in the X and the Y aspect ratio. I use about 15%, and you can see we've got a nice sort of blurry element there. And color mix node, drop that in there. Put the image into the other side. Set this to multiply. And what we're effectively doing now is we're just darkening the edges. And I backed mine off slightly so it wasn't too dark. And obviously you can change the size of your ellipse and that kind of thing if you want to. I talked about depth of field. I've currently got it set to a single depth of field. What we can do, of course, is we can tell the camera to use that empty as the object on which to focus. So if I click that there, and then if I decrease the f-stop, you can see this is where the empty is because it's focusing there. So that might be what you want to do. And that was only 7 seconds to render that element. So you can imagine you can get quite a good little animation for a relatively short amount of time. So I hope you found that tutorial interesting. If you did, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well. And I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.